Welcome to Dylan Experience. My name is Dylan Sessler. I'm obviously your host. Today is episode 22, and we have an awesome guest lined up for you today. My next guest is an inclusive activist, a disabled content creator, a model, and a speaker. She has cultivated and created a space to redefine disability. At the age of 5, she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy after an anoxic episode from a surgery. Since then, she shares her story on what it's like to live with a disability by amplifying the voices of her community to share their laughs, their struggles, and adventures from living with disability. My guest, Paula Carozzo, is recognized as a spokesperson for adaptive fashion, lifestyle with a disability, wellness, accessibility, and inclusive rights. She is a truth seeker, a storyteller, and a role model. She can be found on both TikTok and Instagram. And Paula, how are you?
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much for that intro. I'm extremely pumped to be here with you on this amazing space that you have created, that you have cultivated, always interviewing the most compelling stories. And I'm ready to get inclusive.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Tell me, let's start with just who are you, Paula? Who are you? What defines you? Tell me your story if you want. The floor is yours.
So, by societal titles, I'm a content creator, I'm an influencer. But deep down internally, and I always like to go in deep because I think we allow ourselves to be taken aback by all of these societal terms that we're not really taking them after we leave this earth. I'm a visionary, I'm a storyteller, but most of all, I'm a truth seeker. I really like to get out there, shift perspectives, and kind of give people another side to life. And, this journey of being a storyteller and becoming an activist actually came about when I was diagnosed with a disability. At the age of 5, I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, which is a condition that affects a person's ability to move, write, just any dexterity movements that are affected, any limb movements are affected. And this actually happened in Venezuela. I'm originally from Venezuela, which made my family and I move after I was diagnosed because the country wasn't at capacity to treat me or to refer me to individuals or professionals who would have the specific treatments that I needed. So we moved over from Venezuela to the US, started a whole new journey as immigrants. As many of us know, this country is deeply compelled by immigrants. And we just got here and it was like a new life. It was a new everything for us. And it was also that I could, find the proper treatments and be able to become the most independent adult with a disability that I could. And I didn't really notice that I had a disability until I was about 19, 20 when I was let out into college. And I didn't really have any help from my parents anymore. Back then, super secure parents, super overprotective parents were always helping me, doing things for me. Not saying that they were always doing things for me, but as someone who is limited, there are obviously things that I just couldn't do. Mm-hmm. And being let out into the real world for the first time, I was like, okay, wait, so I have to park all the way here and walk around 1 mile to get to the building here because somebody is in a disability spot without the placard. Mm-hmm. So I was like, okay, I guess this is just something I have to deal with. Then I would get to the building and the elevators were broken. My class was in the 3rd floor. So I was like, okay, so now I didn't just have to walk an absurd amount of distance. Now I have to, go up a whole bunch of steps to get to class. When I went out to get a job, many of the jobs were standing jobs, retail jobs, your first job, you're 18, straight out of high school. It became very evident to me that there was a lack. There were many barriers for people with disabilities. But, I stuck through it because half of my life I was just doing things to do them because my parents didn't really give me a choice. And today I'm very grateful for the the very strong upbringing I had, but it became very evident to me that some things just weren't fair in the disability space. I graduated college. I didn't want to go to school at all. And then 2 weeks before having to pick a major because the limit was due, I had already taken a whole bunch of electives, photography, writing. I was always pretty much into creative pursuits. Yeah. My counselor calls me and she's like, okay, so you've been just taking the fun classes for the past 2 years. You have yet to pick your major. And I'm like, well, I don't really want to pick like something. And she's like, well, then drop out. And I'm like, well, that's not really an option for me. You know, my parents would kick me out of the house. And then I'm like, look, so I kind of like writing, but what would be the easiest major that people in here do? And she said, it's communications. And I'm like, let's do that. And then she's like, okay, but what in communications? There's journalism, there's PR. And I'm like, what's PR? And she's like, PR is when you kind of shape people's opinions, shape brands. And I'm like, that looks cool. Let's do that. Just put that for now. And then I'll figure it out as we go along the way. And throughout college, being a girl that never liked school, I had the worst grades all of my life. I actually started liking PR and I became very good at it. I became very good at pitching, writing, and my professors were at times impressed with my work. And I'm like, this is the first time I ever hear that a teacher's like impressed with my stuff. Like I was impressed at myself. I was like, well, I'm guessing I can maybe make a career out of this. So graduation comes, as we all know. Once you graduate, if you went to college, you struggle a little bit more after to get a job. You might never get the job. I never got the job because I quit my last internship and then I embarked on this activism journey. I started interning at a whole bunch of PR houses, marketing houses, agencies in Miami. And I always had a thing for lifestyle, luxury, and fashion. I loved fashion. I loved expressing myself through fashion. Always had a very like grunge, punk style. And then, you know, the work life also became very evident that there was still a lack of people with disabilities getting jobs because there were certain things in the jobs that I just couldn't do. And I would have to come to my boss and be like, so I need these kinds of accommodations. I need this, I need that. And it was evident to me with their look on their face that this was something new that they had never dealt before. Yeah. And being, you know, it's one thing if you work at big corporations that have specific departments that accommodate you, but then it's completely different when you work for like a boutique PR house that's only, you know, worried about their luxury clients and their high clientele and stuff. And then just sitting one day, I was very tired. The work hours were also very exhausting. You know, marketing PR jobs, they run from around 9 to 8 p.m. You're just there in that office. And then after you either go to an event or you try to get ahead the next day, it's a very rough environment to be in. And I thought to myself, I was like, you know, it's funny. I still haven't had like one client that has like a disability or one client that considers themselves to be like diverse or inclusive. I found myself to be in a very superficial space that no longer nurtured me. It nurtured me at first when interning at college and until a year after when I was still working in that industry. But I didn't see myself all day just pitching clients out to the press about the new bag that was coming out made of fur and that this celebrity was wearing it. So I started I remember that night, I got a notebook and I'm like, so what can I do? What can I talk about? How can I, you know, in a way launch myself? Because I came from entrepreneurial roots and I always knew I was going to embark on something of my own. I just didn't know how it was going to happen. And then I sat with myself one day and I was like, so, you know, I kind of wanted to go into blogging, but going into the blogging of this is what I'm wearing and these are the hair products I'm using. And I was like, that I would suck at that because it's just not me. Like I have no interest in talking about my current hair products because the most I use is shampoo. That's it. Like I had no interest in that. And then I was like, it might be cool to blog about my disability and to blog about what I go through in a day and how much I struggle and how sometimes it's fun and how sometimes there is laughter in the pain. So I called up a friend who was a photographer. She is, but very like mildly into the work. And I'm like, yo, I have this idea. I'm not really, I don't think it's going to take over the world, but I think it would be cool. And do you want to take a couple pictures of me? And she was like, cool. And I was like, okay, but there's one thing. And she was like, what? And I was like, I have 3 canes right now that I use to walk as my mobility device. We're going to shoot those canes with three different outfits because they're going to be my accessories. And she was like, I really like that. And I was like, okay, let's go shoot. And then within the first shoot, the post was up like a week later, and the feedback really like let me know that I was slowly dipping my feet into what would be my life mission. And then here we are 2 years later.
Yeah, here we are. And now you are taking over the world. You've got,
Aw, thank you.
I found you. It's interesting because I didn't actually know you were on TikTok. I found you on Instagram.
Oh, okay.
So like you're sitting there with like 18,000 followers on Instagram. I'm like, well, that's pretty awesome. And then I looked here today. I actually looked at you're on TikTok and you're over 50,000. That's incredible.
Yeah, right? TikTok is bigger because the algorithm, the reach in TikTok is always
just organic,
bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a question I have with your story that's really interesting. I worked. I did a podcast a while back with a guy named Clay, Cognizant Clay. He also has a disability, muscular dystrophy. Okay. And so he's in a wheelchair, and it's interesting to see the parallels of both of your stories because both of you are remarkably strong people mentally because you just, you never really had a choice. It was just this, we got to live. And I saw you did a couple of videos on like why living with a disability shouldn't be looked at as inspirational. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because both of you have that feeling in a sense that I'm just living life. Mm-hmm. And, it's really easy for like social media to idolize people, like yourself.
Struggle, yeah.
And almost misappropriate the inspiration because I think you are inspirational personally, but for a different reason, because I'm a content creator as well, right? Because you've had the ability to step out in front of people, not necessarily because of your disability, but you've had the courage to step out and say, hey, this is what I feel. And mm-hmm. people are going to automatically say, no, we disagree with you. We don't mm-hmm. like you. And that's why I think you're inspirational, not the disability, but the fact for speaking, to speak mm-hmm. your truth, to share. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like the ability, the eloquence of how you express your story is really powerful, and it's clearly making a difference in people's lives. There's people that follow you. So, if you're hitting one person out there that is maybe recognizing their disability for the first time, they're seeing you and seeing, much like many of the inspirational figures throughout history, you might be the first one that they see. You imagine that?
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I'm taken aback because I always, and this is something I preach all the time. I've gotten to work with some of the most notable brands in this world. I've worked with Google, I've worked with Facebook, like I've worked with some of the most notable brands. And I think it's because they understand that there has been a gap. And they also understood that it's a topic that people never really cared to study. We've always been marginalized somehow. Yeah. And now that they see influencers, they're like, oh, wait, so we can target that market through them.
Yeah.
let me do it. And then something I preach all the time, it's fun. Yeah, it's fun to get paid by these brands, and it's fun to work with them, and it's cool to have them in your media kit. But to me, my real paycheck is when I get the DM, hi, I still struggle to accept my disability. Please help me. Like that for me, that's my biggest paycheck. And having that feeling is what certifies that I'm in the correct career path.
That's, I think when you look at the entrepreneurial space and you talk to people that are entrepreneurs, I think people forget how important that is. And I've worked with quite a few people that are, starting their own business or have been in business for a while, and they're like, I don't even know why I do this anymore. Yeah. And they might be in business for 20, 30 years and never have that feeling. Yeah. They don't even know what they're really trying to accomplish. So like for you to have that, like I'm assuming you're in your 20s, right?
Yeah, I'm 26.
For you to have that at 26 is super powerful, right? Like that's, to me, that's inspirational, because that's something that I share is right. I do my work, and I've been an influencer. I don't do it for, I've like 500,000 followers now, and I don't do it for the followers numbers wise. I do it for when someone reaches out and says, hey, Dylan, you're part of the reason that I didn't commit suicide today. And I'm like, it's still, even today, I've gotten those messages for the last 2 years, and still today I'm like, oh, it hits me. And that's I don't want to be people's savior. I don't want to be people's hero. All I want is for them to recognize within themselves the part that I recognize within myself. And I see that reflected in you as well. And that's really powerful. I love that.
Completely. And I think a big part of it is that we live in such a capitalistic society, and this is US based. I'm from, and I mean, like, I think this is every country's goal once they see the US. But I come from a dictatorship, socialism construct. So when people come into the US, and then your worth is measured by your value and how much you make, how much you bring to the table, it's so easy to get caught up in that. And I won't testify and say I've never been caught up in that. It's obvious we've all been at some point. Yeah. But I think the most important part of it is, how much are you willing to not, let your drive come out of the price tag, or how much you can get out of it monetary wise. Right. How much are you willing to sit back and maybe see if you're even happy? Because a lot of us in this entrepreneur space, we love the dollar sign, but a lot of us don't even like being entrepreneurs. We don't like the rush. We don't like the risk. We don't like the shit, this invoice is like 2 months late, and like they haven't paid me, and I'm late on rent. This stuff is hard, man. And then having to sit here and strategize your content calendars and ways to tell my disabled story, like, this is not for everybody. It's not. I feel
so relatable right now, like having, like, this is probably the first conversation I've had with someone that is not only just a content creator by hobby or trade, but like as an entrepreneur, right? Like you are like, you're speaking to the choir here. Like, I feel all of this stuff, right? Which is really interesting. And, like, one of the things that has always been a question that I've gotten a lot with, because I help people, like I'm a mental health coach, right? So I'm sitting here on Zoom meetings all the time talking to people. When I sell myself, and I'm assuming you've done this, you sell yourself in different ways. When you sell you as a product, especially in the mental health space, and I would imagine it's very similar in the disability space, is that people don't understand why you are selling yourself, because they assume that this stuff should be free, right? Like, I'm sure that you've probably felt that. Can you tell me about what that's like for you?
Well, that's actually, and super relatable on that, because there's actually a lot of conversations in the disabled community, because brands don't feel they need to pay us because we have disabilities. They don't feel, so there's this thing in the community called ableism, which is the discrimination towards somebody because they lack the same, in a way, we lack the same physical
physical
and
ability.
mental interactions that somebody without a disability can do. So obviously, in a way, we're measured by, it's just what I mentioned. We're measured by productivity, how much we can bring, and whether all that is fine because we need that in a society to function.
Right.
It's not okay to discriminate beings based, and this isn't only tied to the disabled community. There has been so many conversations about this term in race, religion, cultural backgrounds, everything. And I've received many brand deals where it's evident that just because of the disability, they don't think I should make more than, this other girl who has a less following, who has a less engagement rate, but because of my disability, I automatically make less.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about that? Because I think this lends to almost a bigger question, is that capitalism in general is so functionally about speed and efficiency that there's no place for disability. There's no place for people until it benefits. And so I'm curious, like you talked about working with Google and Facebook. Do you ever feel like these brands are literally only recognizing you or people with disabilities now because they can actually profit from them?
Absolutely. And I think there's a big question on tokenism. When Disability Pride when Disability Pride Month comes around, my inbox, I wish my inbox would look like that every damn month.
Right.
But it does not. And I'm a very honest person. It's how I keep up with my authenticity. It's how I keep up with my being. I'm not rude, I'm just honest. And I did bring out a post during last July, and I'm like, how many of us have been, not victims of tokenism this month, but how many of us have felt it, seen it, gone through it? And a lot of the comments I got were like, you shouldn't be posting this because we're not, brands are going to feel that we're getting offended or that we are, and we won't be considered for campaigns and etc. And I'm like, completely agree. I live off this the same way you do. But at the same time, I need you to see that there's a bigger part of this conversation, because this brand is not going to come back in Black Friday.
Right.
This brand's not going to come back in Christmas. This brand's not going to come back during Valentine's Day. They're going to come back next July.
Right.
When it's Disability Pride Month again. Same thing happens in Black History Month. Same thing happens in Hispanic Heritage Month.
Suicide Awareness Month.
I know it's a very capitalistic thing. We feed off these holidays. It's how the big part of the economy is stimulated in this country. I get it. But I think if brands come in with, within more of an authentic way, like, hey, it's Disability Day on December 3rd. Would you be open to doing something? But if you just contact me on the Pride Month, I'm not necessarily going to turn down the opportunity, but I'll be sure to be on social speaking about tokenism.
Right. So what do you think is it's such an interesting topic, because I feel like there's obviously good parts to that. Like, even though there's like bad intentions almost, because companies are here for the profits, at the same time they're still getting the word out. So there's good and bad in there. So what do you think what's the risk versus reward? Do you think this is a good thing for the disability community? Do you think it's a bad thing? What do you think brands could do better? What do you think?
I think I'm not going to be turning down jobs just because they come around during Pride months. But I always like to come around, and me being a publicist before I ever embarked on this social media space, I know how to pitch myself. I know how to do my own marketing decks. I know how to do my own proposals. So for me, it's a way of staying relevant and pitching out campaigns throughout the year.
Yeah.
To these brands, it's being like, hey, X and YZ brand, we had our collab on July for Disability Pride Month. but you know, I've seen this new launch of your product and I would love to be a part of it, regardless if you already closed out your budget for this campaign. Please keep me in mind for a next collab. Stay relevant so that these brands get a grip that you're not just relevant on that 1 month of the year.
Right.
You don't have to have the most perfect pitching decks. You just need to have a little format saying who you are, that you worked with them before, that you're open to working with them again. I think that proves to them that you want to be out there, you want to be relevant. And if there's ever a need to bring up tokenism in the email, do it. You know, not like, oh, I've been a victim of tokenism, but definitely like, you know, kind of have my feelings out there about this, would like to address this differently moving forward.
Yeah. So what do you think are, and I don't know how much outreach you have with, like, how often you talk to other people with disabilities, but how do you see the impact mental health wise with things like tokenism, or, you know, even bullying? But like, how do you see how do you see that manifest in people for like the mental health aspect of things? How do people react?
You know, I think we're all happy and excited when we get like an email or something that we want to be featured and that, but then when they don't come back around until the next year, you're kind of like, oh, so that's what it was for, you know? So I think this is more of like an epiphany stage that most of us have, rather than like something that we can catch on quickly. It's something more that I let people figure out on their own. Because if I come in being like, oh, they're only contacting you because it's XX month, they're gonna be like, oh, you're so negative. And I'm like, honest, I can understand why you're seeing me as negative, completely valid. But, you know, I kind of just let people figure things out on their own. And we do have these conversations all the time in the disability community and in the inclusive space. Like, such and such brand contacted me for this, and then, you know, this happened. And, you know, these are conversations that we have, but I think it's something very personal to manage, because I don't know your income. I don't know what you need. I don't know your struggle. I don't know if you're well off for the rest of the month. Right. So it would be very poor of me to make judgments on somebody who I don't know. And even if I knew them, I'm still in no place to judge them.
I love that mentality. I really do. That's something that I've built into how I look at life. And I think that's really important, to have that ability to say, I don't know what you're going through, even if you think you do, right? Like,
you're not,
you know, me and my wife, like my wife is pregnant and I watch her every day. Yeah. It's been a remarkable thing to see, but like, you know, my wife is pregnant and I'm watching her go through these things, but at the same time, that doesn't mean I know exactly what's going on. Cause you never know. Even when people think they can explain everything to you, they can't, because there's so many dimensions to human thought and human feeling and emotions that when we look at these things, we just don't. And so, you know, I think the most important things you can do to help people in the mental health space is start with the functional idea that says, I have no idea what you're going through.
Literally.
And you can try to explain it, but I won't. And so how I come at that, you know, I think that what attracts people to me is that I don't try and help you. I try to help you help yourself. And I think that's really powerful. And I see that, you know, especially talking to Clay. Clay is a remarkable man. I love him. And he does a lot of interviews with people with disabilities and people who help people with disabilities. And that's one of the things that like is really powerful in the disability community, is that there's people that just try and focus on how can you help yourself? How can you create independence? And I think, you know, if there's anything that we can, and I'm going to kind of go against you a little bit here when you say we shouldn't look at people with disabilities as inspirations, because I think there's a piece of this that we can, is that people with disabilities have been forced to innovate in a way that other people do not know how to do. And that that is inspirational on its own. It's not the disability. It's the fact that you have had to be forced to innovate and kind of deliberate within yourself about what do you have to do now. That's a really powerful place to kind of sit. And every disabled person I meet has I feel it, in myself, like this persistence, this tenacity, this like chip on their shoulder almost. I love that because it's so powerful. Like it's so relatable for me to meet someone like you and to meet someone like Clay. It's awesome. I love it.
I think, I've always said I can't rule out and I won't dictate how you or anybody perceives inspiration, because that's a very personal thing. That takes emotional intelligence, that takes upbringing, that takes how your parents raised you and what they found inspiring. What gets to me and most of the community is when these stories, these movies come out that we had to work, and excuse my French, our asses off.
Say it. Say whatever you need
that
to say.
We had to go through dirt and mud. And yes, I understand, but to me, it's not inspiring to show up somewhere and the elevator's not working. To me, it's not inspiring that I have to bitch somebody out because they're just casually chilling in my disability parking spot. So I think there's a very big gap on what we find inspiring and on what actually is inspiring. The tenacity, the adversity, the drive, yes, 100%. The inaccessibility, the unequal rights, the unequitable pay that drove us to these features. That's where the question is.
Right.
How much inequality do I have to go through in my life to be seen as inspiring? That's kind of where the question is, and where most of us question ourselves. I think it was a couple months back, there was this movie premiere of this girl that she had some intellectual disability, and they crafted her story more on her being heroic for overcoming the disability, for defeating the disability. I'm not here to defeat shit. This is how I'm going to stay. Sorry to break it to you. Sorry to break it to the many people who think they're going to defeat their disability. I was raised by parents who taught me to defeat a disability, who taught me to overcoming it. Instead of sitting with it, accepting it, and loving yourself for who you are. And that's what I had to teach myself and struggle with for the past 5 years of my life.
So what was it? Right. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I think that's such a profound kind of realization, not just within the self, but within looking at your environment in general, is that you were taught something that didn't functionally work for you. So what was it that started to change your mind or help you perceive this in that way?
There was a big part of my life where, and I'm guessing this was my parents' way of building this tenacious woman that can go through anything life kinds of throws at me, and I'll just keep walking with my cane like if nothing is being thrown at me. But there was this big conversation of, you're not disabled. Stop calling yourself disabled. The disabled are people with intellectual problems and mental health problems. And I'm like, but mom, I have physical limitations and by the book. I'm not saying that I always go by the book, but it's either black or it's white. It's barely ever gray in my world. And there was a big part of them that neglected the fact that their kid had a disability, because either they didn't want me to struggle the way people with disabilities struggle. It's your kid. You're always going to try and shoot for the best that they can be. And I think it was a part of the immigration process. Latins, being from Venezuela, were very like disabled. What is that? That does not exist in our book. And the disabled live like in specific towns, they live in hospitals. They just don't really interact with people who don't have disabilities. So, immigration, coming to a new country, I didn't realize when I was growing up that my parents were also playing a role in being a kid with me. It was the first time they were encountering this shit too. Having a kid who is going through a disability and you're going through that makes you, and you going through that for the first time, makes you a kid with a disability too. You have no time to be an adult. You don't know what you're going through. There's no adulting when you haven't really built a way to be an adult at something. It doesn't work. So I think a big part of it was I was neglected from who I was for a very long time. And then adulthood, I was like, you know, back when I was 18, 19, I still had this like thing in my head that I was going to walk normal one day and that everything was going to be fine because that's what I was brought up to think. And then when I really sat with my orthopedic one day and I'm like, look, I've been going through this for 15 years now. Do you mind explaining to me what I really have? Am I gonna get better? Is there a cure? Like, can you run me through this shit? Like, just you and I without the parents? And at that moment, when I was around 19, I knew I understood what a disability was for the first time. And from there on, I kind of took it upon myself to just accept it. Because the more I ran from it, the harder it was going to be for me to be at peace with myself.
Yeah, I mean that's such a it's the realization part that really always gets me is like I tell people a lot like the difference between rationality and logic. Rationality is this idea that everything you've ever felt in your life is valid. It was real. It was cause and effect. It was simple, right? Did it always make sense? No. And that's where the logic side of, functioning comes in, is that you have to determine at some point whether what you're feeling is valid or not. And I think at some point, and you've kind of, you're confirming this for me in many ways, there's a divergence of who we wanted to be and who we had to be to survive. And that divergence is basically what we're trying to heal, right?
Yeah.
Is that we're stepping into two different realms of life and we're trying to operate as two different people. A lot of people will suppress the side of us that wanted to be that specific person, but it's always there, right? And so regardless of how you suppress it, you're still feeling it because that's your body, and I think, you really looking at yourself and you really looking at that self-realization of, who am I really is more or less kind of bringing the two together. I don't think you can ever go back to this person that you wanted to be necessarily. It's kind of bringing them together and building that reality of this is who I am. And that didn't make sense. This is what I can validate. And this is who I don't have to be anymore to survive, and having that conversation, not only with yourself, but with the people around you that support you is really important. And I think that's, it's really profound that you've been able to do that and have that realization. And at 26, that's such a powerful age to do something like that, because I'm going to be honest with you. I work with people and I get comments from people that are 40, 50, 60, 70 years old that are still struggling with this realization that they are not who they wanted to be. And they had to be someone they didn't want to be to survive. I mean, it's really powerful that at 26, you're doing this. And such an awesome thing to see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's taking, it's been rough. It's not, we all have this idea that self-love and self-care is like pretty, and it's get yourself flowers and take yourself out on dates. And I won't deny, while that's part of the process, there's also anger, there's also tears, there's also like confusion. You're like, what the fuck? Like, how? But I think it's all part of it. Without it, you wouldn't get there. So
it's dark. It's really dark. It has to be, I think, because, in a way, like, we were told to live our lives thinking we need to be happy. But the reality is like, you need to feel sad. You need to feel anger. You need to feel happy. You need to feel joy. You need to feel upset, right? Because all of those emotions function as a communication system, both ourselves and to others, right? Paul, if you piss me off, I need to say something. Otherwise, I'm going to internalize that conflict. Yes. And that's not good, Yes. And so, I mean, it's really interesting to kind of hear, your take on how you've kind of lived through this, and to see that it's remarkable.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I wanted to go back to something that, you touched on, and we talked about it a little bit beforehand, but something that maybe isn't discussed as much, and that's the mobility devices. And what is that? What does that mean? What is a mobility device? Tell me about, like, how does that function for you, and how do you see people looking at that, and what are the stigmas around that you see, or tell me about it.
So mobility device is anything that aids, that helps somebody gain independence who has a physical or mental limitation. I know people who have schizophrenia, who have bipolar, and who use mobility devices because whenever they go into an episode, they get dizzy. They get extremely dizzy, or they have a shock of somehow and they lose it, So mobility devices are not something that should only be limited in people with physical disabilities. I mean, let's go back in history for a little bit. Canes were actually used by the most successful people, by the richest man. So I'm a rich man in this era using a cane. But I was around 20 years old. I started going to college. Well, I started going to college when I was like 18, but the distance between the buildings and how much fatigue I was taking on from it, I was like, I can't do this anymore. Yeah. And I would try to park as closest as I can. I would try to pick my classes as closest to the car as I could. And I was just dead tired. And my dad was like, you should get a cane. And I was like, canes are for old people. Like, come on. So imagine like the stigma I already had in my head from what society kind of had taught me about mobility devices. I was a girl that started her journey off in a wheelchair when I was first diagnosed, then moved to a walker, then moved to nothing. So me going back to a mobility device, to one that necessarily didn't look like a walker or a wheelchair, but it was still a mobility device, I was like, I cannot go backwards.
It was like being defeated again.
To me, it was going backwards. Yeah. And then, so I kept taking it on as what you're taught to do when you have a different substance, or you just take a beating. Yeah. And, one day I was just dead. I couldn't even move. And my dad got me a cane. He's like, look, just try it, use it. And if you don't like it, we'll burn it. And I was like, I'm going to burn it right now. I got so mad that day. I was like, I'm going to burn this right now. And then I started using it, and I started falling so many times, bloody elbows, bloody arms, because I had, like, it's hard, like to train yourself out of the wheelchair into the walker, out of the walker into nothing for like 7 years, and then going back to mobility device. It was tough. But little by little, I started getting used to it. I started feeling a lot better. I didn't start feeling as fatigued. People with CP, if you're off the wheelchair, you tend to have a lot of balance issues. So that was for me a huge issue. I would trip, kind of do like a dip, a fall. They were never drastic, but it was constant.
Right.
And I started using the cane. I felt better. And I think when I started using the cane, my dad is very big into antiques. And every time he would go to an antique shop, he would get me a cane. And they were these beautiful, like wooden Japanese, like canes with like Japanese writing on them. I had no idea what they say. For all I know, they were like dictator canes, and they say like a whole bunch of like slaughtering stuff in them. And I'm here walking with that shit proudly. And then really like the canes started opening my eyes to wearing different canes, buying different canes, matching them with different outfits. I had always been into fashion. And now I have over like 20 canes. And we literally started off with just 3. And I mean, if you go on my profile, the canes are like it, that's like what people know me by.
Yeah, it's interesting. And my grandpa passed this year, but he had, kind of something similar. I think he was a woodworker. So he would make his own canes. And it was something that he was very passionate about. So he had like 20 or 30 of them that were all like beautiful. I kept 1 or 2. It kind of goes back to like the tribal times, like walking sticks. Like I'm a big woodsman. Like I'm actually going camp. I live in Wisconsin. I'm going camping in a couple days, right? Like I go in negative 20-degree weather and I love it, right? And so like it kind of reminds me of like the tribal era of humanity, and where like we would pick up a walking stick or a spear, and it was a representation not of just a tool, but of who we are. You'd hang beads or feathers from that spear or that walking stick, because it was a representation of your own identity. And I think that's really powerful that you're able to look at that and make it a part of you. I think that assimilation of this is my reality and I'm going to make the best of it is a mindset that is rare. Like that's what I think is so powerful about this, is that it's a rare thing to be able to assimilate something like that into who you are. And I think you've done an incredible job.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, I think there's going to come a point in your life where you're not going to have a choice.
Yeah.
And there's also going to be a point in your life where you're going to figure out that if you keep that as a choice, it's just going to keep you ill.
Yeah.
So I think, it was, and, I had so many realizations between my 21st birthday and my 23rd. I think that's where it all started going downhill, because by 23, I had already started posting the first picture on Instagram. So I think that was like a very big time for me on identity, on like the self, and figuring out, who I wanted to be, what I wanted to be, and why. And without those years, I would probably still be, struggling somehow.
Why do you do it?
Why do I do like the activism stuff, or just in general?
Anything. I would love to hear your answer on that. And like, so why do you think the way you think? Why do you do the activism stuff? Like, why do you do these things? What is your why?
My why is, I've always, ever since I was a little girl, I really liked to fuck with people. And I'm sorry, but I was a bad kid. Like
I did not expect that.
With my disability and everything, I was always like, I was a bad kid. And I was like, I would drive my sisters crazy. There was always a big part of me to rebel.
Yeah.
To kind of cut my chains off myself. Because even if I didn't get myself into those chains, it was my job to get myself out. Simple. And I think that I've always been into like, I've always been anti-religious. I've always been into astrology. So that's always been like a big part of me where my mom is like, oh God, why? I'm like, well, mom, if you look at the planetary placements right now, you know, Uranus is in a very tough part of your chart. You know, like I'm always going against everything that was always considered normal.
Yeah.
And then life gives the kid a disability. So that's like, let me put more shit in the pot. Let me make this kid more different than she already is. And for so long, it was like a big part of me was like, I need to cut this chains loose and I need to be who I am because I'm just imagining all the people and who are struggling not only to be who they are in a world that limits you from that, but also who are neglecting from being who they are by governmental and societal oppression.
Yeah.
I was like, the time is up for this bullshit. It's gone. And then that's when I started the whole Instagram stuff.
Yeah. How interesting. I mean, it's, how do you feel about like, you know, coming from Venezuela to America, you know, like, how do you feel about, will you ever go back? You know, what do you think about the difference in society?
It's very different. Venezuela, it's so funny because people are always like, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm from Venezuela. And they're like, do you travel there often? I'm like if I complain about the US not being accessible,
Yeah.
you don't even want to know like
Right.
what goes down in Venezuela. I think there was a big part of my parents who in a way didn't even think about the American dream when we got here. It was like, I need my daughter to heal. I need my daughter to be able to go to school. There were like no disability rights in Venezuela. They were even neglecting me to go back to my elementary school because I already looked different. I was in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And the school curriculum didn't accept kids that either needed extra help getting around or needed extra help with intellectual disabilities. So my parents didn't even have time to like chase an American dream.
Yeah.
It was like, let me come to the US, let me see what treatments we need. How much does it cost? What do I need to sell to, to be able to pay for these treatments? Where are we gonna live? It was like boom, 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 boom. And looking at it now, I understand that they were being a kid with me in this journey. They had no idea. And if raising a kid is already tough as it is, imagine raising a kid who has a condition or a disability and you having to go through that as a parent when you're trying to do everything that you can to make sure they don't suffer or struggle. Some things in life are just inevitable.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to parents that are going through that process? What would
I would definitely say don't neglect their disability. Don't neglect that they have a condition. Don't neglect that they're gonna live a little differently, because if you neglect it now, chances are they're gonna have to deal with it later.
Yeah.
Like I did. And I think that there is so much work that parents can get ahead with on their parenting if they just teach their kids to accept themselves. You're done with being a fucking parent, man. You're done. Like, first day, accept yourself. You mastered. You're done.
Yeah.
You mastered. I'm not saying let your kid get into trouble and let them commit crimes. No, teach them right things. But I feel that a big part of my conversation was that I was never allowed to see myself for who I really was, for who I really am, until I broke free from their perspective.
Yeah. Parents, that's definitely something that I butt up against, because I deal with people with, I've been through trauma, I've been through domestic violence. And typically what I see is parents are the beginning of it, right? Like you grow up in a household in which things like abuse and dominant communication is, for lack of a better term, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, right? all of those things kind of tend to be the precursors to allowing yourself to be put into a relationship where physical abuse is done to you, and it's difficult to kind of get through to that, because you have to dismantle the perspectives that you've built because of how your parents taught you to believe and how your parents taught you to think. Because you've never been allowed to think for yourself. You've always had to appease others. Otherwise you would be in trouble. And it's really interesting. I'm a stepfather right now, and I'm obviously going to be a father. And it's really interesting to have these conversations and think about like how I operate in my son's, in my capacity. And it's like, man, it's hard. Being a parent is so difficult. And I can't even imagine, what it would be like to kind of walk that path with someone, a child that's going through disability, trying to fit in, trying to accept themselves, when the world, right. And you and Clay have really taught me this. The world is literally trying to tell you
otherwise.
You're not here to fit in. Right.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to see people like you and people like Clay that are able to step outside and see themselves. I have so much respect for both of you.
Thank you.
Especially what you're doing. Like I love when you said I like fucking with people. I mean, it was like, I did not expect you to say that, but I love it, because the world needs that in many ways. The world needs people that are willing to say, I'm here to fuck shit up. Right. I'm here to step in the middle. Like I'm tired of this political correctness. Like, I don't want you guys to stay both sides. I want you to have real, honest conversation. That's something that I do, like this shirt, my shirt says mental health stigmas don't break themselves. Like stop dancing around the subject and talk about the real shit. Like, like we all have bias. Like we all don't see what we don't see. And so we have to be able to say, Paula, I didn't know that, like I fucked up. And when we can have that honest conversation and have respect for each other, we can solve problems, Oh
my God, 1,000%. And I think it always takes, like, we always see like the political correctness and things like, okay, so if I want to do something for the government, I need to like knock on 20,000 doors of 20 different governors and then get to the mayor and I'm just like, okay, fuck all that. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to destroy them a little bit. And then we're going to come with this marketing strategy. And then we're going to kind of like do a little protest outside. Like, that's my way of thinking. But it was how I maneuvered my way all my life. Yeah. I didn't walk until I was like 6 years old again. I was diagnosed. I started, I paraplegic, went into bed, started crawling. And these are things that as a baby, you don't remember.
Right.
But when you were able to run, and then at 5 years old, you went to an anoxic episode and you became a paraplegic. Yeah. You're like, oh, wait, so I have to do this shit all over again, but now I'm actually going to be conscious of it. Like, now I'm actually going to see how much hard fucking work I have to put into crawling, because as a baby, you don't remember anything.
Right.
You're just wired differently. You're wired differently.
Yeah. And it's that's in a sense, that's trauma, and trauma changes the brain, and I think that's, now that I see that, like, it's the innovation that changes. I think it forces the brain to actually innovate in ways it never had to when you were a kid, because you were this is just I see adults walking around, so I have to learn to walk around.
Yeah.
But when it becomes something of trauma, when it becomes something of, I already learned this, why do I have to learn this again? Mm-hmm. There's a wire, I think, somewhere in there that turns off in a direction that it shouldn't have to. Mm-hmm. And we just become different. In many ways, it's the similar to like what I had to deal with in the suicide of my father when I was 6. it was a wire turned off in a direction where I said, I'm different now, you know.
Yeah.
Is it the same thing? No, not even close, but it's a struggle, right? And it's important to, I think, you know, when you're talking about activism and having discussions and doing, you know, doing what we do as being content creators and trying to influence people.
Yeah.
I think it's so fundamentally important to come at it from a place of respect, right? Where, you know, like me as a creator, I respect that there's going to be a person that comes on my platform and says, Dylan, you're wrong. Dylan, you're an asshole. Dylan, you're this, you're that, you're all of these. And I still have respect for that person. Do I have a conversation with them? Not always, but there are people that I'm willing to say, why do you think that? Because I have a respect for this person to know that they have a reason why they are saying this. And I need to know why, so I can address the problem for the long term.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not necessarily speaking to change society today. I'm speaking to change society in 25 years.
Yeah.
Because that's how you change society.
Yeah.
You can't change shit overnight.
At all.
It doesn't happen.
And I think, you know, as this social media space continues to grow, and this is something that I've seen not only in the reins of my PR career, but also as launching myself in the activism space, people, as mental health keeps shifting, the consumer is going to be more interested in the activism role, because their interests are also going to become more prone for helping, instead of, oh, the shoes and the bag. And I have no judgment for people who live off talking about their hair and their style. Honey, if I could do it, I would. I really, really would. I would. But, you know, life just kind of guided me towards a different route. I'm happy where I am, but I do really see the consumer mindset shifting and needing to experience a connection with this, you know, influencer, with this big person, than just seeing them like posting cute stuff all the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a, you know, social media is in a sense a platform of leadership, right? And if you disagree with an influencer, you have the ability to post about it. You have the ability to question them. You have the ability to counter them if you feel, you know, necessary.
Yeah.
And so, you know, like, it's interesting to see like the echo chambers kind of segregating.
A lot.
And I think I saw something about TikTok kind of saying like, we're going to work against that. And so like, if you get so divided in content, like they're actually going to put opposing content into your For You page, which is interesting. But it's people like you and I and the many other mental health content creators that are showing that there is a stigma. There are these negative things, and which is funny because people are like, oh, there's no stigmas anymore. Therapy's fine. You know, disability is okay. We're cool with this. But the reality is stigma still exists. The ableism still exists. The racism still exists. And we need to have functional discussions about how we can from both sides, how you can deal with the racism, the ableism, the stigmas, and then how we can fix, you know, these things, because there's part of us that actually benefited from the issues that we went through, but
of course
we didn't need to.
Right.
Like we didn't have to go through those things if we were supported properly, you know. And it raises questions for me as to, you know, like, I look at my father's suicide at 6 years old as being one of the most influential points in my life, the most important point for where I am now. It's been my inspiration. And I think if I were to go back and if I had the choice to take it away or not, I wouldn't, which is, you know, for most people, they wouldn't understand, but I do. And that's all that matters. But it raises the question of what is what's the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how much do we support people versus how much do we have to let people innovate?
Yeah.
And like, where's, that's an interesting question for you. And it's an interesting question for obviously me. And I think we're always trying to figure that out. But
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? Where do you see, like, in the disability realm, what's too much support and what's too little support?
Well, I think the obvious things, like just like you taking up a handicap spot when you shouldn't be there, like why? Like I get it, you're close to it, but no, there's somebody who might actually need that spot.
Right.
So for me, that's an example of like common sense. But then of course we have the conversations of like, accessibility in the infrastructure and in architecture and in design, and where things actually get really more complex. And then you have conversations with like the CDC director this week where she claimed that, she is encouraged by the results that the people who are currently dying from this Omni variant are ones who were already ill. So that's kind of like saying, and I know that in the American media, there's a lot of speculation, but the fact that you're not careful with your words gives these communities more of a voice to complain. Yeah. Not to complain, but to kind of, be right about what, why is she saying that she's encouraged by the results that only the ones who already had conditions or were ill are dying from, I mean, looking at it from a point of view where I wouldn't have a disability, it's kind of like saying, okay, so the ones who are already sick, which could be my grandma, is the one passing away from Omni, and she's encouraged by that. Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of conversations to have still, but I think it's important to allow each activist to play a role in the parts they are interested about.
Yeah.
I get tons of DMs every day. You should push this. You should fight for this. And I'm like,
so should you. What are you doing?
And while like a big part of me being here right now with you and having a digital presence is because I made people's issues my issues, even if they weren't my issues. When you start growing and when you start innovating and expanding your entrepreneur, your calendar starts filling up with things that you didn't even know could exist.
Yeah.
You're like, what? An NFT chat? The fuck is an NFT? Like, right. You're like, what is this? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And there is so much more less time for you to kind of not pay attention to other people's concerns. But I think that by giving them the initiative to do stuff themselves as well, you're not only allowing them to innovate, but also take pride and take responsibility in what's important to you.
Yeah, I mean there was a quote, and I'm gonna mess it up. It was by Gandhi, but like, good leaders don't create followers; they create future leaders. Like I love that, and that's what I try to do. That's what I've had a few of my clients and fellow followers. They were like, I have always wanted to write a book, and your book inspired me to write that book. And I'm like, do it, right? Like, don't let my voice be the only voice that we have, sharing these messages. Like,
exactly.
Take for mine, attack mine. I don't care, right? But continue the ball rolling and having these conversations about disability, about mental health, about suicide, about all these things, so that we can continue to learn and adapt and grow the conversation in general, so more people hear it, versus 1996, when that was the first time I had ever dealt with suicide, and people were telling me it was selfish and he was a sick man, and all of these things that we didn't know the consequences of these things back then. Because no one ever talked about it, and same with disability.
1,000%. I agree with you. And I think that, I think there's a big conversation today, and I think it's decreased a bit. Oh, how many followers do you have?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, how many likes do you get? That has decreased a lot. And I think it's because people stopped looking so much at the numerical value of things and more at the quality of like the content, the messaging, the storytelling. We are highly driven by storytelling. And many of us won't be able to do it, and that's fine. Just like how I won't be able to do a cashier job because your girl will not be able to stand for 10 hours. Like, it's non-negotiable for me. You know, but I think if you make it your responsibility to speak up about the issues you care about somehow, whether it's just by going around and speaking with your friends, you don't have to have a platform, you don't have to have tons of followers, but the fact that you make it known, that's already one step into it.
And you don't even need to know what you're talking about. You can ask questions and together, like, you know, it was interesting. I had an experience at Christmas this year, which was a little bit different for our families, that we had a conversation about trauma. We had a conversation about like what my family went through. Like, you know, obviously we've been, like, me, my mom, and my sister all went through my father's suicide, but you know, my parents both had alcoholic parents throughout their lives. And so having this conversation about emotional abuse, physical abuse, trauma in general, it was different, right? Like it was me and my cousin and my wife, who are all, you know, we're all in our 30s now, having conversations with 50-year-olds, explaining to them what trauma does to people. And for the first time, you know, it felt like they had never known it, you know, like Gen X and the boomers, they don't understand this stuff because it was never it was never a conversation back then.
And it wasn't only a conversation, it was as well that they were guided by such bad information. Like, how would you say that somebody who commits suicide is selfish? That's a stigma. There's a whole world in there that is not understood. Or doesn't feel that it fits in, and that it's not understood. And that's what drives people to these actions. You know, and the fact that you're able to speak about something like suicide, like, so openly, I congratulate you for that, because just the word itself gives me shivers, like gives me goosebumps. Like, it's something very deep.
I mean, I wrote a whole book on it pretty much. You know, like for me, it's suicide is the same thing, you know, as disability is for you. As this, you had to innovate with that. I had to innovate with this. And so for me, it was something like kind of similar, not necessarily same time frame, but like similar in timeline. And it wasn't until adulthood until I actually started to like actively address the problem
and understand it.
And
because that's something else that takes a huge toll. We're so guided by the wrong information.
And we don't know how to look for it, right? We have Google and some of the best search engines in the world, and we still don't know how to look for the right information.
I agree.
And that's where, you know, you said earlier, is like, it's the quality of content. Like I can't wait to stand in front of a high school and say, how many of you learn more from TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube than you do at school? And for teachers to actually look at their students and see all of the hands get raised, right? It's going to be a remarkable situation when they actually realize that these social platforms are actually becoming the education system, because there's quality people saying quality things and asking quality questions
that is not taught in school.
Exactly.
I get most of my financial literacy off TikTok, I'll be honest.
Right. You know, it's remarkable to see, like, we have built an education system to replace the old and dying education system that doesn't know how to be updated. You know,
it's crazy. And college is another conversation that I think we'll need another podcast for. But just the debt and the pressure and the things people do on themselves to get into these schools, to graduate. And I'm not saying everybody graduates with debt. Most of them graduate with debt. you'll walk out, you won't be able to get a real job. And by real job, I mean just like a real title where you feel that you made it to what, the next 3, 4, 5 years. That has always been bunkers to me. But I still did college because I was like, I'm getting this crap paid for. I'm one out of many who don't have this opportunity. Let me just do it. I was lucky enough to find something I liked and it worked out. But otherwise, I would have been a dropout, and I admit it 1,000%.
Yeah. And I am as well. It's interesting because I didn't drop out of undergrad. I graduated undergrad, but I dropped out of graduate school.
Okay.
Interesting circumstances. I had to go to Afghanistan. I was just like, I'm not going back. But it's like, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I wouldn't have used it. I love what I do now so much. And I know that the last, going back through grad school, I certainly would learn stuff, but I don't know if I would have been allowed to learn what I wanted to learn, because academia in many regards has not been, it's been restructured in a way to fit the agenda rather than allow students to ask the questions that they want to ask. And so the lack of identity being allowed in, it's interesting because it's like this schools are all trying to be super politically correct and allow everybody and include everybody, but the education itself doesn't always fit the narrative of we're trying to be inclusive, to give you the opportunity to learn. And
I agree.
It's hard,
I always testify there are so many careers that you do need a degree for. There's people who want to become doctors, there's people who want to become lawyers, engineers, people who need these degrees. By all means do it. But if from a young age you kind of sort of feel that you have entrepreneurial roots like I did, and that you were always going to be your own person somehow because that's all the world has taught you,
right?
I would highly suggest for people to take some time off, study life, study the world, and then go into college. And this pressure of I was somebody highly pressured by, you need to graduate by 22 because by 22 you need your first job. And I was very on top of everything. I'm 26 now and I still don't know what the hell I'm gonna do tomorrow. So it's a very fake social stigma as well.
I mean, the whole culture has transformed, and it's going to transform even faster because of social media. It's just creating such turnover at a rate that we've never seen before in history. And it's, for me, I graduated at 25. I went to Afghanistan at 22. So I could have put a lot of weight on my shoulders to try and graduate as soon as possible. But it was like, when I came back after Afghanistan, my entire life perspective changed.
Everything. Right?
And I really started to, I really enjoyed sociology, the subject I studied in college. But once I got to grad school, after 2000, I think it was 2016 when I got to grad school, I enjoyed it, but there was stuff that I was trying to study, very related to what I'm talking about now, that was not, like, I was shunned in many ways. I was kind of pushed aside, like neglected, in a sense of like, I have these ideas that are plausible and you can't answer the questions I'm asking, but you're neglecting them. And so what do I do with that? Like, it got to a point where, like, again, it was about the agenda, it felt like to me, and it wasn't about like, hey, you should pursue this idea. Here's a direction, which is what I think an education is for, is like, you're supposed to guide the person trying to find the education down the road that they're trying to understand. And it wasn't, it was understanding violence. It was understanding, like, I've always looked at sociology and I've wondered, like, why do we study things like racism and crime and stuff like that from the lens of like human behaviors, but we don't study violence and how it's literally the foundation, to me,
Yeah.
of how these things happen, right? Like we look at violence as an indication of homicide rate or assault rate.
Yeah.
Like, how does that have any understanding? How does that give you any understanding of violence? Right?
Going off topic for a second, I want to ask you, what year were you deployed to Afghanistan?
2012 and then 2019.
So that was still a consequence of 9/11, correct?
Yeah, it was still enduring freedom at that point in 2012, and then it changed to, oh man, something resolve. I can't remember what the last operation
Yeah,
was.
well, like when they brought you guys back home, right?
No, it was, so 2012 was a year they were closing down a lot of bases, but it wasn't
Okay.
it wasn't the full
It was
kind of.
2019.
Yeah, 2019
Yeah.
was right before. So 2020, I think was, or 20, no, it was last year. It was 2021 when
Yeah,
it was a full withdrawal.
it was during Trump. And completely off topic, what are your thoughts on like what you went through 20 years later after 9/11?
Oh man, that's a big
Because
question.
I think that was one of the most I think that was one of the biggest American foreign policy errors in history, in my opinion.
You know, I I don't prescribe to know all of that, right? Like that, I don't think one person can really understand the full scope of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. And most certainly, we can't understand anything yet with everything as classified as it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly things that are going to come out in 50 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
When documents get declassified. But I I was in Afghanistan and I met a lot of people in Afghanistan. I think there was merit to what was happening. I did my research before I went to Afghanistan on the Taliban and their practices and their procedures of how they ruled. And it was, think about this, right? The Taliban would put people that they didn't like in Connex boxes. Those are those big shipping containers. 50 to 100 people in one box, tight, right? And lock them and leave them in the summer. And these people would die in them. Now, personally, I just think that's such a remarkably tragic and traumatic way to handle governmental issues that what we did was change the face of Afghanistan in general. Was it under the right circumstances with the right initiative? I don't know, but what I do know is it changed the face of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the 20 years of relative freedom that we offered is going to linger. And it changed the Taliban in general, right? Like you look at the Taliban in 1990, or I'm sorry, 1994-ish, when they kind of took power, 1996, I think. And you look at them in 2021, 2022, they're a remarkably different organization, right? They're not the same. It's kind of like looking at what a Democrat was in the Civil War versus what they are now. Remarkably different. And are they still bad? Probably, but they're not as bad as what they were in the 90s. I would hope. I haven't kept up with Afghanistan since, but I think Afghanistan was we went there for a purpose. We went to kill Al Qaeda, and we kind of did, right? Yeah. We got Osama bin Laden. We may have armed them. This conversation could go all the way back to the 50s, really, right? And beyond. But we did what we came for, and I think we also showed Afghanistan and the Afghan people a semblance of freedom. And in many ways, I think it was a good thing. And in many ways, I think it was a bad thing.
Yeah.
There's no beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, at all. At all.
Yeah.
But it's completely off topic, but I had to ask you that because I'm always, very intrigued by that whole situation and how it happened and how it lingered for such a long time.
It's complex. My what was it? My minor in undergraduate or undergrad was Middle Eastern studies.
Wow.
The Middle East is complicated.
Very,
it's
yeah,
man, like that conversation.
It's a whole other world of its own. Yeah.
That conversation can go back 100 years and we still wouldn't get to like the real understanding of what went wrong. Iraq is a different story. And that's
it's funny because they're all different stories within themselves.
Yeah.
You have Israel, you have Afghanistan, you have Iraq. They're like different worlds, all of them, with different beliefs, with different, all trying to fight for their own freedom, and it's different.
It's scary in a sense because in 1990s, Afghanistan was warlordism, right? It was basically 3 blocks away, John Bon Jovi's over there controlling 6 blocks of territory, and Jordan is over there in the east controlling 12 blocks, and that was how Afghanistan was run in the 90s, right? After the Russians came in and demolished Afghanistan, it was whoever held the most power and had the most people following them, the generals or the leaders of the Russian Afghan war, they control the territory. And then the Taliban came in as a united front from Kandahar and Helmand, and then controlled the country through like pure violence and pure fear, and then created a self-sustaining ecosystem of the madrasas of like Pakistan and Eastern Afghanistan, where they taught kids their version of Islam. And it was a very extremist version of Islam. It's basically like a cult here in America. It's so watered down that it was, it wasn't even the Quran anymore. It was the Hadith that is it's not the word of God. It's the words and the quotes and the stories of Muhammad. So it's a different document. It's a supporting document to the Quran, but it's not, it becomes almost a really extremist and secular kind of identity that's only taught in one way. And because in Afghanistan, which is really interesting, the Quran is only read in Arabic, right? It can't be translated. And so in Afghanistan, they speak Pashto, they speak Dari, they speak everything but Arabic. And so the people who have control of the language have control of the people.
Of course.
And so you get to teach them whatever you want. And guess what? Martyrdom is cool. And so when Afghanistan was invaded by America, guess what? It was a ripe environment to create suicide bombers and, warriors who would martyr for their people and their country. And so like, how do you beat that? Well, the only way you beat that is you stay for decades so that you can break that cycle of education. Education is remarkable. I think education is underrated in terms of how powerful it is.
It is. And teachers are underpaid.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very underpaid. But Dylan, quickly, I'm on 2%. I don't want to lose you.
Sure. So
I don't know if you do we do like an outro? How does it?
Yeah, I mean, let me ask you the final question, and at someday we'll reconnect. We'll get some more.
Yes, of course.
Let me ask you this, Paula. If there was a message you could leave the world, what would it be?
I think, and this is a message I'm always preaching it. If you think you're good at something, and if you think you can take it to be the best at something, you definitely deserve to give yourself the space and an opportunity to craft it, master it, practice it, do it, and if it all goes beautifully, profit from it.
I love it.
That's like my last word for anybody out here trying to figure out who they are, figure out what to do with their life. If there's one thing that you like, grow from that, because chances are those could be branches to a tree you never knew was planted in your yard.
I love it. I love it. It's such an entrepreneurial mindset. And I think it's so profound. And I don't think I don't think anyone should ever be afraid of profiting from it. I think what you should be afraid of is profiting in a way that you're hurting people.
Of course.
That's what I think needs to be understood about entrepreneurship. And, even my space of mental health is like,
yes,
I don't profit from this in a way that I'm hurting people, because I put my profits back into things like a text platform that has 1,700 people that I send messages to every day. I bring value, and I'm sure that you probably follow Gary V in many ways and learn from him. It's a remarkably important place to be. Bring value, right?
1,000%.
I love it. It's a great message. Well, Paula, thank you so much for being on. This has been a great conversation. I'm sure
Thank you for having me. Thank you for, giving me a space to talk about my life, my mission, my message. And I hope we can, definitely do another podcast together soon.
For sure. We will. I'll be in touch with you. We'll make sure it happens.
Perfect. Thank you, Dylan.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for everyone that's watched this point. It has been a great episode, and we'll see you next time on episode 23. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Boom.